I was about to say buenos dias a todos, force of habit. But okay. So I haven't been here the past couple weeks. I was in Raymondville, at least you're aware. I was helping out over there, and now I'm back. And one of the interesting things being over there is it takes a minute to get over there, about 40 minutes, 35 if you're me, to get to Raymondville. So, I had a bit of time to drive. And during that time, to keep my mind occupied, I like to have something playing in my car. Usually, maybe I'll have music, I'll have a YouTube video, I'll have a podcast that I'm listening to. Maybe I'm just having the verses that I'm going to go over for my lesson. I'm having them on repeat. Just something to keep my mind entertained as I'm driving. And recently, one time when I was driving, I was listening to, I believe it was a podcast or a video, and this guy was talking. He was a non-religious guy, and he brought up what he believed were the tenets of Christianity. All right, awesome, it works. Okay, so he first talks about how, Christians he believed that Christians believed in 4 fundamental things. One, that there is a God, and that God created the universe. Does this work? No, it doesn't. Okay, that's fine. That there is a God, and that he created the universe. I think pretty straightforward. We all as Christians, we agree with that. He pointed out that Christians believe that Jesus is the Son of God, and that Jesus died on the cross and was resurrected on the 3rd day. I think something we all also believe as Christians. It's very fundamental to who we are and what we believe. A third point that he brought up is that Christians believe that you must believe in Jesus to be saved. Not the whole picture, but it is true that we have to believe in Jesus, we have to repent of our sins, we have to be baptized, and follow our lives as Christians, to live lives as Christians. So mostly right overall, what this one guy pointed out. But the final point was something that really, it got me thinking. The final point that he brought up was that we follow the 10 Commandments. That he brought up. That's a point that Christians believe that we follow. And I had to generally stop and think, do we as Christians actually follow the 10 Commandments? It's interesting because, like I said, this guy, he's non-religious. I believe in that podcast I was listening to, he said he didn't grow up with religion. So this was just based off of what he had learned, from seeing stuff and such. And, if you look at Christendom as a whole, from an outside perspective, like this one guy was talking about, I can see where he's coming from. If you look online, there's been constant stories of how, Christians, people who call themselves Christians, who fall into the realm of Christendom, have tried to have the 10 Commandments displayed in public places like courthouses or federal places, government buildings, and how that's created controversies with secular people and stuff. I'm not going to get into the political debate on whether or not, the 10 Commandments should be in government buildings or should be in public places. I'm not here to discuss that. But the question I have is, as Christians, should we be holding up the 10 Commandments to this level? If I was a Jewish person, definitely, the Jewish people, they follow the Old Testament. The 10 Commandments are part of the Old Testament, so it's a fundamental part. So if I were to hear stories of Jewish people who were trying to have the 10 Commandments put in public places, that's straightforward to me. I understand that. But should we as Christians be demanding the same? And that's what I want us to talk about today, is the 10 Commandments and how it applies to us as Christians, what we can learn from it. The first thing what we must understand as Christians is that we no longer live under the old law. In 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 25, it's part of the verse that we usually read, or one of the main verses we read whenever we have communion. Paul, he is reminding the Corinthians of what it means to partake in the communion. In verse 25 it reads, "In the same way also he took the cup after supper, saying, 'This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me.'" Focus on the part that's highlighted there, that's in bold. This cup is the new covenant in my blood. When we partake of the communion, when we eat of the bread and drink of the cup, we are partaking of the new covenant that we are part of as Christians. Being part of a new covenant, this new pact, this new law that we have with God, that implies that there was once an old law, the Old Testament. So we have to ask, if we are now following this new law, how should we look at the old law? Paul talks about that in Romans chapter 7, verses 4 through 6. he talks about, likewise, my brothers, you also have died to the law being the Old Testament, the Old Covenant, the covenant that they used to follow before they were Christians, that you had died to the law through the body of Christ, so that you may belong to another, to him, that being Christ, who has been raised from the dead, in order that we may bear fruit from God. For while we were living in the flesh, our sinful passions, aroused by the law, were at work in our members to bear fruit for death. But now we are released from the law, having died to that which held us captive, so that we serve in the new way of the Spirit and not in the old way of the written code. Paul here is reminding the Christians in Rome, in this book here, in this letter, about how, as Christians, we no longer serve that old law. We are dead to that old law. When we try to apply the standards of the old law to us, we are considered dead to it. And, on the surface, that should scare us, but when we remember that we are part of the new law, this new covenant with Jesus, we are assured that we don't have to be shackled by the old law, that instead we are released from it, that we are saved because of the new law, and we can rejoice in that. So that is an important fundamental thing we understand. When we look at the Old Testament as Christians, it's not to be held in the same way that we hold the New Testament. That's not to say the old law is bad in any way. Far from it. It has much great value. I'm sure I've given multiple lessons here, and I always like going to the Old Testament because there's so much to learn from it. In the following verse, Romans chapter 7, verse 7, Paul even answers that question because people, I'm sure, brought it up to him. If we no longer follow the old law, is it bad? Is it something to be discarded? And Paul says, far from it. What then shall we say? That the law is sin? By no means. Yet if it had not been for the law, if it had not been for the Old Testament, the Old Covenant, Paul says, I would not have known sin, for I would not have known what it is to covet if the law had not said, you shall not covet. So while we do not follow the old law anymore, we can still learn from it. It can still teach us as Christians. It can help guide us in our faith, in our walk with God, to help us be more mature Christians. That's why I and many others love to go to the Old Testament, because there's so many lessons we can get from it on what it means to follow God, what it means to obey Him, and to grow in our faith. So what I want us to first understand is, as Christians, we do not directly follow the Ten Commandments because they are part of the old law. They are foundational to the old faith. But rather, instead, we as Christians follow the principles of the Ten Commandments. The principles which we're going to go over today are still fundamental in our faith in following God. So by no means am I saying, are the Ten Commandments bad? Far from it. They are great. They are holy. They are sacred. But we need to make sure that we understand, that the principles of the Ten Commandments are brought forward in the New Testament, and that's what we follow. We don't follow the old law anymore, but rather we follow the new law, which is what we'll see today. So that's what we're going to go over today, the Ten Commandments. I've got a bunch of slides, a bunch of verses. If y'all want to write them down, if y'all want this PowerPoint, let me know, because we're going to go through a lot of verses. So first off, the Ten Commandments, very straightforward. It's found in Exodus chapter 20, verses 1 through 17, and Deuteronomy chapter 5, verses 6 through 21. So important, God had to have it listed twice. The first commandment is, you shall have no other gods before me. The second one, you shall not make for yourselves a carved image. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. To observe the Sabbath day, the fourth. The fifth, honor your father and mother. Very important, y'all. The sixth one, you shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness, and you shall not covet. Most of us, I think, already know these. We learned them in Sunday school. We've learned them in VBS. And I want to go through each and every single one of these and see how they carry over to the New Testament, and how we can still relate them to our faiths as Christians, those who follow the new law, who follow the New Testament. So before the Ten Commandments were given, there was a preface that is given right before them. In Exodus chapter 20, verses 1 and 2, God states, and God spoke these words, saying, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. So before God even gets into the Ten Commandments, before he gives them these fundamental rules to the Jewish people of what they need to believe, he wants them to first understand who is giving them that law. That it is the Lord their God, the one who rescued them out of Egypt, who took them out of slavery, the one who created the heavens and the earth, the one who has the highest authority over any other. So it's important we understand that, that the Ten Commandments come from the highest authority, from the highest law of the land, the highest law of the universe. Likewise, in the New Testament, we see this level of authority that's given. In Matthew chapter 7, verses 28 through 29, at the end of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, many point out, and when Jesus finished these sayings, the crowds were astonished at his teachings, for he was teaching them as one who had authority and not as their scribes. Jesus, I was giving a little bit of this lesson to one of the kids earlier today, and the way I described it is how the difference between a teacher and a substitute teacher. How a substitute teacher, they have authority because they are given authority by someone else, whereas the teacher has authority because they have authority. And that's what was unique about Jesus and God. The scribes, the Pharisees, they have authority because they were given authority by someone else. Someone told them the law. But Jesus, when he spoke as if he was a teacher who was bringing that authority. Who was the person they could trust in. So it's important that we understand that. In John chapter 8, verse 58, I love the way that Jesus says this. He's being in this section. In this part of Jesus' life, he's being confronted by the Pharisees, and they're asking him, what makes you so special? He talks about how he remembers Abraham before he was born. So they were saying, the Pharisees living thousands of years later after Abraham ask him, right before John 8:58, they ask him, how would you know Abraham? He is our ancestor. He lived thousands of years before us. And Jesus just gives such an amazing answer. And Jesus said to them, truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was, I am. That Jesus, being the Son of God, how he has this high authority, that he is before all and after all, and that we can trust his word. We can trust that the authority that's what's taught to us in the New Testament, that's brought to us by Jesus, is from that highest authority, just like the Old Testament is given by the highest authority by God. So it's a very powerful thing, something that we can be absolutely confident in as Christians. Going through the commandments, the first commandment, Exodus chapter 20, verse 3, you shall have no other gods before me. I think pretty straightforward. The idea, God, he prefaces by stating, these rules that I'm giving you that you need to follow, these come from the highest authority, and in fact, they come from the only authority. You should have no other gods that you worship. If you go through the Old Testament, how many times many of the Jewish people failed even this first part, how they began to worship other gods, due to their kings, due to the politicians of their time, how they worship gods like Baal or Asherah. But it's important that we understand that when we follow God, we only have the one God, that there's no other God. Likewise, the New Testament teaches this first commandment. In Acts chapter 17, verses 23 through 25, here Paul was giving the sermon on Mars's Hill, if I'm correct, in Athens, basically. He is going through this land of the Gentiles. The Greeks at the time worshipped their gods like Zeus or Athena and such, how they had these gods for all these different parts of the world. And they had an altar for an unknown God, because they had so many gods, they felt like they were probably missing a God. So that's why they had an altar for this specific unknown God. And Paul used that to teach them about the one true God. Starting in verse 23, for I passed along and observed the objects of your worship. I found also an altar with this inscription, to the unknown God. What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it, being the Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man, nor is he served by human hands, as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything. Here he is preaching to the Greeks that this unknown God, this one that they're uncertain of, not only is he the most powerful God, he is the one who created everything. He is the one true God, that all the other gods that they're following, like Zeus or Athena or any of the others, that those are false gods, that this unknown God is the one that they need to turn to and worship. And he continues that in the rest of his lesson. But also, not only, are we not to have these false gods in our lives? I use the example of the Greek pantheon, but it's important. Jesus talks about how in Matthew 6:24 that no one can serve two masters. How we can put others up, we can put other things in our lives up to this altar, to this level of godhood without really recognizing it. Matthew 6:24, no one can serve two masters, for he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. Here Jesus is giving an example of something that we might not consider a deity, money, the pursuit of wealth. We wouldn't I don't think most of us would consider that as some holy thing, but often what can occur is in pursuit of wealth, in pursuit of money, it's very easy for us to elevate it to a higher place, to be on that hustle, to be on the grind, as some would say, that we place it as a higher priority than following God. We place it as this God to us, and we need to make sure that we watch our hearts and we watch our minds, whether it be in the pursuit of money, the pursuit of happiness, whatever it be. We need to make sure that we don't elevate it to a place, to that level, the way we are supposed to elevate God. The second commandment in Exodus chapter 20, verses 4 through 6, God talks about how they are not to have any carved images, they are not to have idols, which follows from the first one. Not only are you to not have any other gods that you worship, but you're to not have any idols in your lives. God talks about how he is a jealous God, how he expects them to only worship him, and if they worship something else, he will punish them for it. But if they only choose to worship him and follow him, he will bless them for it. Likewise, we see this principle in the New Testament. In 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 7 and verse 14, verse 7 states, "Do not be idolaters, as some of them were, as it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play." In verse 14, Paul reminds them, "Therefore, my beloved, flee from idolatry." The letter of 1 Corinthians was given to new young Christians at the time in the church of Corinth. Many of them had only been Christians for a few years, were very young Christians. So before they became Christians, they were living, they lived in idolatry, that it was common for them to worship, the Greek gods or the Roman gods or whoever it was at the time. So Paul here is reminding them, to flee from those things, to abstain from that, and to remember that they serve now as Christians only one God, that being the one true God. So we see this principle is carried on into the New Testament. The third commandment of the Ten Commandments states, "You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain." God explains to them first, there are to be no other gods, they are to have no other idols, and that his name is to be holy and to be sacred. And if they do not take his name seriously, they will be punished for it. Something we understand, the idea of swearing by God's name, or, how people will use God's name in very unserious manners, stuff I don't want to say, lest God punish me. Likewise, this principle is carried on into the New Testament. In Matthew chapter 5, verse 34, Jesus states, "But I state to you, do not take an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God." That people will say, they swear by God or they swear to God. How by saying that they are taking the Lord's name in vain. They are playing with his name. They are not taking it seriously. And Jesus is reminding them, not to do that, for they will be punished for it. James in chapter 5, verse 12, the first section states, "But above all, my brothers, do not swear either by heaven or by earth or by any other oath." Later on, we're going to talk about lying and how it's very important that our yeses be yes and our nos be no. That we don't need to swear, we don't need to use God's name to sound serious, to come across as serious. That when we speak of the Lord's name, we have to recognize how important that is. And if we use it flippantly, if we do not take it serious, we will be punished for it, and that very greatly upsets God. So another principle that from the Old Testament that is carried over to the New Testament. The fourth commandment is definitely a very interesting one. The fourth commandment being about the Sabbath. Here, God, in creating the Ten Commandments for the Jewish people, he reminds them to keep the Sabbath day. I only recently learned this, actually. The Sabbath doesn't officially start on Saturday. It actually starts Friday evening and goes till Saturday evening. So I was surprised to learn that recently. But the Sabbath day, we understand being the end of the week. We understand that principle coming from when God created the universe, how it took him 6 days to create everything that we see. And on the final day, he used that day as a day of rest because, he saw his work and it was good. And as a result, he was able to rest. So God created the Sabbath for the Jewish people, for the Israelites, so that they could work the 6 days, worshiping God, doing their personal work, and that final day of the week they could rest. But to also, but as highlighted here, that they needed to keep that Sabbath day holy, dedicate that time to the Lord. As Christians, we do not directly have a Sabbath day anymore. And in fact, one of the issues that arose with time was the Pharisees, the ones who had the political power, the institutional power over the Jewish people. They began to perverse the idea of the Sabbath. The Sabbath was supposed to be a day of rest, but a day that was holy, a day that was good, a day that was supposed to be dedicated to the Lord. And yet the Pharisees and the Sadducees began to impose all these laws on the Sabbath, telling people that they could not leave their houses, they could essentially do nothing. So Jesus, being the Son of God, as we know, he went out and about preaching to others, healing those, even working on the Sabbath. So there was a situation that was presented to him in Luke chapter 6 of a man who was sick, who needed help. But it just so happened to be that day was the Sabbath. And the Pharisees wanted to test him, saying in their hearts, thinking, surely he won't heal him. Surely he won't do good to this person. After all, it is the Sabbath. He's not supposed to be working. And Jesus calls them out for that. In Luke 6, verse 9, and Jesus said to them, I ask you, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save life or to destroy it? He is reminding them that, yes, the Sabbath is a day that we're not supposed to be working, we're not supposed to be busybodies and such, but when a situation comes that you can do good for someone, that you can be a blessing in the same way that Jesus could be a blessing to others, that took priority, because doing good to others is part of what it means to follow God. God expects us to be good, to do blessings. So as a result, God still healed that man, even though it was the Sabbath day, because he was trying to get them to understand, yes, it's important to not work, but what's more important is to make sure that you're worshiping God. So if your work requires you to worship God, that can override the simple idea of not working on the Sabbath. And like I mentioned, while we don't have a Sabbath anymore under the new law, we do have a spiritual successor, that being right now, that being today. In Acts chapter 20, verse 7, Luke here, he is recording his time with Paul. On the first day of the week, when we were gathered together to break bread, Paul talked with them, intending to depart on the next day, and he prolonged his speech until midnight. Here we see that they're just having regular church services like we do, how on the first day of the week now, we gather together and we break bread, we partake in communion like we did a little while ago when Andy had it. And Paul talked with them. He's essentially preaching to the group there. It's interesting to me that his speech prolonged until midnight, kind of implying that they started their services a bit later in the day. So, as a night owl myself, I approve of that. But regardless, we see how the first day of the week, the first century church used that as a time to dedicate towards the Lord, to dedicate towards a fellowship with their brothers and sisters, to partake in communion, and to learn from the Word of God. So likewise, while we do not have a Sabbath anymore today, we do have this time now, which is a spiritual successor to the Sabbath, a day that we keep holy, a day that we dedicate towards the Lord. The fifth commandment is given in Exodus chapter 20, verse 12, stating, honor your father and mother, that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. Very straightforward command. I think we're all aware of it. Growing up, it wasn't exactly my favorite command, but it's something that I had to do. In fact, this lesson is brought over to the New Testament. In Ephesians chapter 6, verses 1 and 3, Paul writes, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and your mother. This is the first commandment with a promise, that it may go well with you and that you may live long in the land. very straightforward. The same principle that is carried from the Old Testament of honoring our father and mother is brought towards in the New Testament. It's an interesting question. Why is something like being good to our parents so fundamental that it has to be one of the 10 commandments? Well, it's very straightforward. The foundation of society is the family unit, is the mother and father with their kids. If that foundation isn't held secure, society ends up crumbling as a whole. So just as parents are supposed to love their kids and to raise them in a good manner, likewise the kids are to honor their parents, the kids are to obey their parents, and as a result they will be blessed from it, they will learn from that, and it will benefit them for the rest of their lives. As Paul states, it is the first commandment with a promise. We talk about how there's many ills in the world, but how so much of it could be easily resolved if we simply remember the importance of the family unit, trying to keep the family together, having the kids recognize, the importance of authority, their parents, to obey them, to learn from them, and for the parents to do good unto their kids, to teach them well, to help raise them into good people, into good followers of the Lord willing. And how that could be a blessing, not just to God, but to society as a whole. The sixth commandment, like I said, we're going kind of fast through these. The sixth commandment in Exodus chapter 20, verse 13, you shall not murder. The sixth and seventh are very interesting. It's very straightforward, very blunt. Do not take someone's life with intention, the idea of that. In math, this same principle is carried over to the New Testament. We know very straightforward that we're not to murder, but Jesus, in fact, actually expands on this principle. In Matthew chapter 5, verses 21 through 24, it states, Jesus, in his Sermon on the Mount, speaks, you have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not murder, and whoever murders will be liable to judgment. He's saying he agrees with that. It is true. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. Just as those who murder, are held guilty on Judgment Day, those who are angry with their brothers, those who have malice in their hearts, how they will also be held to a similar judgment. Continuing, whoever insults his brother will be liable to the council. Those who are harsh or mean to their brothers, insult them in a way, will also be held, will be judged for that. And whoever says you fool will be liable to the hell of fire. How insulting others, how showing anger and malice to others, how we can be punished for that. Verse 23, so if you're offering your gift at the altar and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother and then come and offer your gift. Jesus is expanding on the Old Testament by reminding them not only should you not take life, but your heart should be in the right place, that you should try to live well with others to the best of your abilities, to make peace with others, to have that level of harmony that you can. We're not always going to have that, unfortunately, but as much as we can to make amends with others, to be in good standing with others, to show love to others, that our hearts don't hate others. That is something that can be very difficult because our emotions can often be hard to control, how people can anger us or frustrate us. But it is important as Christians that, not only do we not act on bad impulses, but those bad impulses, those bad thoughts, that we control them, that we try to be at peace with them. The seventh commandment is a very similar principle, or at least the way Jesus expands upon it. In Exodus chapter 20, verse 14, God states that thou shalt not commit adultery. Very straightforward. We understand adultery to be sexual immorality outside of marriage. And Jesus not only says this is right, but just like the sixth commandment, he expands on it. A few verses later on his Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 5, verses 27 through 30, it states, you have heard it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. For it is better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. For it is better you lose one of your members than that your whole body go into hell. So here, not only is God saying, do not partake in adultery, do not commit the act of it, but also to watch your mind, to watch your heart. If your heart lusts after others, and it puts you in that vulnerable position to God. That is also sin, just like adultery is. To have lust in your heart is to essentially state to yourself that if you could, if you see someone and you have that lust for them, and in your mind you're essentially saying, if I had the opportunity to commit adultery with this person, I would. God is stating that is sin too. Not only is it that we are not to commit it, but we are to make sure that we control our mind, that we control our heart. Jesus talks about how there may be things in your lives. He uses the example of the right eye or the right hand, that if they lead you towards sin, if they tempt you, that it is best to get rid of those things and to not allow them to control you, not allow them to lead you towards sin. So just like the idea of murder, not only is it that we are not to commit the act of adultery, but we are to also watch our minds, to watch our hearts as Christians, and make sure that we don't have the desire to commit it or control those desires if we have them. The 8th commandment, very straightforward, just like the previous two. In Exodus chapter 20, verse 15, God simply states, "You shall not steal." That we are not to steal. It is very straightforward. And in the New Testament, we see this principle is brought to it, but it's also expanded upon. There are a few verses, I believe, I didn't write the ones down, that, talk about how thieves, will also be cast into hell, that they are sinners too. But I like the way that Paul elaborates on this idea. In Ephesians chapter 4, verse 28, in Ephesians chapter 4, he's talking about the new life that we as Christians live, how, we once lived a life of sin, doing stuff like stealing or maybe even committing adultery or murder or whatever it may be. But as Christians, we live a new life where we no longer do those things. In Ephesians 4:28, when he talks about stealing, he talks about how let the thief no longer steal, but rather let him labor, doing honest work with his own hands, to essentially be a regular citizen in society, to have a function, to have a job, to work, to make his own ends meet in a just and an ethical manner. But not only that, not only so that he could support himself, but that he could also, as it states, so that he may have something to share with anyone in need. That not only should the thief, depart from taking from others, but he should change his heart to the point that where he's wanting to give to others, to help others in need. In Acts chapter 20, verse 35, Paul talks about how Jesus once said, "In all these things I have shown you that by working hard in this way, we must help the weak and remember the words of the Lord Jesus, how he himself said, 'It is more blessed to give than to receive.'" I'm not saying, receiving is the same thing as thievery, but, you can think a thief is only thinking about themselves, hoarding for themselves what they need, what they want, and how Paul is talking about that. It is better to not simply only desire, not simply only want things, but that instead we should also give to others, that we should help others out in any way that they need, instead of being a liability to someone, to be a blessing to them, to help them out in a way, in any way that we can, whether it be monetarily or giving them time. Maybe we have a possession that could help them out and we no longer need it, so we give it to them. Whatever it be, the commandment of stealing is expanded upon in the New Testament, to not only simply take from others, but rather to give unto others, whether it be our resources or our time. I think of Zacchaeus. I didn't write him down. Zacchaeus, yeah. How he had stolen from others in taking their money, and how he talks to Jesus, how he repents of that and says, "To those that I owe, I will give fourfold to," how he wants to now, do what's right and to give more unto others, to be a blessing unto others. The 9th commandment, actually doing okay on time. The 9th commandment in Exodus 20, verse 16 states, "You shall not bear false witness against your neighbors." Very simply, do not lie, do not make false testimony if it means it hurts someone else especially. So a very straightforward thing that the Jewish people were supposed to understand and to follow. This same idea is expanded upon in the New Testament. In Matthew chapter 5, verse 33 and verse 37, "Again, you have heard that it was said to those of old, 'You shall not swear falsely,' that you shall not lie, you shall not bear false testimony, but shall perform to the Lord what you have sworn." That's what the Old Testament teaches, that if you're saying you're going to do something by the Lord, that you have to do it. And Jesus expands on that by simply stating, let what you say be simply yes or no. Anything more than this comes from evil. We do not need to lie. We do not need to deceive. We do not need to swear by any means. All we need to do is when someone asks us something or someone expects us something from us, we just must give them the truth, whether it be yes or whether it be no. Jesus wants us to understand that it's very simple, very straightforward like that. In James chapter 5, verse 12, the second half states, But let your yes be yes and your no be no, so that you may not fall under condemnation. That we must be honest, we must be truthful with someone. That if we can do something, we say yes. But if we can't do something, we simply tell them no. We do not need to lie. We do not need to make it more complicated than that. That the idea of lying, of bearing false witness, it doesn't need to be this whole gray zone. Just simply say the truth. And that's what's expected of us as Christians. The final commandment, the 10th commandment, in Exodus chapter 20, verse 17 states, You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male servant, or his female servant, or his ox, or his donkey, or anything that is your neighbor's. Very straightforward. They lived in a society, they lived in their Jewish society. God wanted them to understand, to live well with one another, to not envy the possessions of each other, lest tensions arise and problems occur. And this idea is expanded upon in the New Testament. In Luke chapter 12, verses 15 through 21, Jesus gives the parable of the rich man who had a great many possessions. I love the way he states it in verse 15. And he said to them, Take care and be on your guard against all covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions. The idea of coveting, of wanting the newest thing, wanting the newest shoes or the newest phone, whatever it is, how if we end up wrapping our lives around that, how it can control us. And God is reminding us, that the abundance of possessions is not what's fundamental to us. What's fundamental to us as Christians is to follow the Lord, is to serve him. And he tells them the parable of the rich man who had so much, and how having all of this great wealth, I believe it says, how the grain that he had harvested from his land, how it caused him to live very, very gluttonous in a way. It states in verse 18, I will do this. This is the rich man stating, I will tear down my barns and build larger ones, and there I will store all my grains and all my goods. And I will say to my soul, Soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry. How this idea of covetousness, of constantly wanting more, it causes our mind to indulge into those things, not thinking about God, not wanting to worship him, but instead worship our possessions, worship the temporary things in our lives. And God calls him out. It states in verse 20, But God said to him, Fool, this night your soul is required of you, and these things that you have prepared, whose will they be? So is the one who lays up treasures for himself and is not rich towards God. Jesus gives this parable to remind them, coveting the things of the world, coveting the possessions of others, how it causes us to lose focus on God. If we see someone with a nicer car than us, or a nicer phone, or nicer shoes, or whatever it be, it shouldn't have to bother us. We should simply acknowledge it and move on with our lives, recognizing that the greatest gift that we have, the gift that we have in Jesus, is far greater than any possession that we can have on this earth. So I love the way that he expands the final commandment there. Jesus does. So, in concluding everything, why did I go through the 10 Commandments? It's something, that I mentioned at the beginning. It's not something we directly serve. And I think most of us knew this stuff already. I'm sure most of y'all knew what verses I was going to go to anyways. But why did I go through all of those? I think about that guy who I heard on that podcast or as a video, whatever it was a while back. I think about his misconceptions about Christianity, how common it is to believe that. I think about the people who wanted to put up the statues of the 10 Commandments in public places and government buildings. I think, outside of like political arguments and stuff, I think, that they have a level of right intentions. They believe that is the good religious thing to do. To have those things present, to show that we are supposed to be a Christian nation. And while I can understand that, I feel like they're not understanding the purpose of the 10 Commandments. You see, during the times of the Old Testament, yes, the Ten Commandments, and by extension, the Old Law as a whole, it was sacred. It was a fundamental part of one's faith, part of the Jewish faith. But as a New Testament Christian, someone who recognizes that we no longer follow the Old Law, the Ten Commandments, and by extension, the Old Law, they're no longer tools, or we no longer follow the Old Law. It doesn't judge us at the end of the day. What judges us is the new law, the new commandment that is given to us by Jesus. But that the Old Testament, the Ten Commandments, they are useful tools that can help guide us towards Christ. Just like the Old Testament, as Paul talks about in Romans 7:7, how it taught him what sin was. It taught him what was right and wrong. And that helped guide him towards Christ, ultimately in the end. Likewise, the Old Testament, it is no longer fundamental in the same way the New Testament is, but there's still a lot to learn from it. We can still respect it, we can still honor it, and it can still help us grow as Christians, and it can still help us serve God better. Like I mentioned earlier, as Christians, we do not follow the Ten Commandments directly, but rather we follow the principles of the Ten Commandments. Those important principles that I laid out today, I know it's a lot of verses, how those principles carry over to the New Testament, and they are a core part of our identity of what it means to be a Christian now and what it means to serve God now under this New Testament that we follow. If you feel like you have not been serving God, that you feel that you have not been following the principles that have been outlined in the New Testament and in the Old Testament, you can make that change today. You can choose to follow God today. If you choose hearing his word, believing in him, repenting of your sins, confessing him as Lord, being baptized into the waters today. I believe these waters are ready. If not, we'll find something else. Today is a good day to be able to choose to follow the Lord. But today, Lord willing, is not the only day. If you feel like, if you are a Christian and you feel like you've been slacking, that you haven't been holding the principles as high as you're supposed to, that you've been falling short, you can come forward and ask for prayers today also. We here as your brothers and sisters in Christ, we care about you and we want to help you out. I love the way how Sebastian has brought it up before. You can go to a fellow brother, a fellow sister in Christ, and tell them of your struggles. They will pray for you. They will support you. We are a family here, and of course we care for one another. If you have any needs that need to be made known, you can come forward as we stand and sing the song of invitation.